Welcome to another episode of Theological Table Talk. My name is Keith Stanglin. I'm the director of the Center for Christian Studies, and it's good to have you here listening. We present here an episode that was recorded before the pandemic when we taught at Austin Graduate School of Theology. This and a couple of other episodes were intended for a podcast that was never realized. Well, we didn't want these good conversations to go to waste. And so we want to bring them to you here with Center for Christian Studies Theological Table Talk. And so you'll hear on these episodes various colleagues of ours at Austin Grad. Stephen Lawson sometimes emceed these conversations. And Center for Christian Studies carries on the best of that legacy from Austin Grad in our goal of providing excellent resources for Christians. And these conversations are just one small aspect of those resources. So we present these episodes as we recorded them, unedited in all their glory. I hope you enjoy them.
Welcome. This is Stephen Lawson, professor of theology here at Austin Graduate School of Theology. I'm joined by my colleagues, Dr. Jeff Peterson, professor of New Testament here, and Dr. Keith Stanglin, professor of church history and historical theology. And we are pleased to welcome for our interview today with Mary Eberstadt. She came to Austin Grad in the fall of 2019 in order to deliver the annual First Things lecture, which was given on September 30th at University Avenue Church of Christ. Mary Eberstadt is a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington. She is the author of many books. Our most recent book is entitled Primal Screams: How the Secular Revolution Created Identity Politics. She's also written books entitled It's Dangerous to Believe, How the West Really Lost God, and Adam and Eve After the Pill. She was also author of a 2010 novel, The Loser Letters, about a young woman in rehab struggling with atheism, which was recently adapted for stage and premiered in the fall of 2017. She's written in many magazines and journals, including Time, the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, First Things, the Weekly Standard, and Policy Review. So, welcome. Mary, before we get to talking about your new book, Primal Screams, I wanted to ask you about a provocatively titled and very interesting piece you published in First Things just over a decade ago, entitled The Vindication of Humanae Vitae. And I think for many of our listeners might not be familiar with Humanae Vitae. So if you could say a little bit about what Humanae Vitae is and what you argue about Humanae Vitae in that 2008 article.
Humanae Vitae was an encyclical set down by Pope Paul VI in 1968, and it's safe to say it was one of the most reviled public documents of our time. And what's interesting about that is that the encyclical didn't really say anything new. It was a restatement of almost 2,000 years of church teaching about a particular subject, which was contraception. And in keeping with 2,000 years of teaching, from the earliest days of Christianity onward, the church said that this is off limits for Christians, and it gave various reasons why that was so. So in the article, arguing that Humanae Vitae was right, I looked at the predictions that the document made, because it made several very specific predictions about what would happen in the world if the sexual revolution took hold. And using perfectly secular evidence, I was able to demonstrate that those predictions had come true. For example, the document predicted rising infidelity and rising trouble between the sexes. I don't think anyone would argue that during the past few decades we've seen exactly that. The encyclical also predicted that coercive governments would use these technologies coercively, and we have seen that certainly in the case of China's one-child policy. We've seen it in India, and we've seen it in other examples where governments use these new technologies of birth control to keep populations down. So the argument of the piece was simply that we can see that these predictions have been vindicated in hindsight, and that Christianity was getting no credit for this vindication, because in the world after the sexual revolution, people didn't want to listen to arguments like these. And that's why I thought it was important to put forward this countercultural argument about the church having been on the right side of history in this case.
So that's, it's really interesting. And I think that's an important background to your most recent work. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about another article of yours from a few years before that, 2004, in the Policy Review, where you argued, you titled the piece, Eminem is Right. And I think it's an interesting juxtaposition that in just a few years you're describing how the rapper Eminem and popular music is right, and what seems to be counterintuitive that also is right is Humanae Vitae, this very traditional statement about Christian sexual ethics and the family. And so if you could maybe connect those two, is okay, how is Paul VI right about abortion and contraception, and how these things will break down the family and social structures that support the family, and also what we might think of as pretty secular, unchristian, maybe misogynistic at times, music, is also right. So if you could say a little bit more about the pop music and how you found that to be also correct.
Well, it goes to the point that we should find truth wherever it exists, and I think there is a kind of deep truth embedded in contemporary popular music. I started looking at this 15 years ago in the essay that you describe, and at the time, some people will remember rap was very controversial because of its violence, its misogyny, and so was a lot of contemporary rock music. And there was a lot of talk in the air about whether we should censor this stuff. And so I started listening to it, and what I found really surprised me. What I found was that the signature themes in contemporary rock and rap were themes of family abandonment, dysfunctional families, fatherless homes, that the popular culture through this music was bringing to life what sociologists had been describing for decades. And I was really struck by the fact that a truth was arising out of these places that I think people weren't hearing, maybe because they couldn't push past the profanity. But Eminem is very much the incarnation of what I'm describing, because his songs are all about being abandoned as a child, about having to be an adult in a world where adults had abdicated their responsibility. And so, again, in its way, that body of work is a testimony to the same kinds of truths that are described in Humanae Vitae, truths about the human person, about how we're not meant to, live as these autonomous creatures, but rather to live in community, beginning with the community of the family. And the other thing that both of those bodies of work have in common is that they describe what happens, just how destructive it will be when the community of the family no longer exists. And so I think they're very aligned that way as truth tellers of different kinds.
Mary, we've talked a little bit, alluded to the sexual revolution. I think most people have a vague concept of what that is in the 1960s. Could you just describe what we mean by the sexual revolution? What are its constitutive elements?
Sure. Well, first and probably most important was the technological shock. The birth control pill was invented. Humanity had always had access to contraception of different kinds, but this was the first time that there was something reliable with like 99% reliability, allowing women, quote, to control their fertility. And it was like the apple in the garden. It was something that humanity could not resist, or at least large swaths of humanity. So with the embrace of artificial contraception, despite the fact that it stood in contradiction to long-standing Christian teaching, that embrace ended up leading to a number of outcomes that I don't think anyone at the time could have foreseen. One was within a few years of the pill, we have the Supreme Court legalizing abortion. This pattern obtains not only in the United States, but in every country that decriminalized, embraced, and destigmatized contraception within years, whether you're talking about Argentina or Ireland or lots of other places. The embrace of contraception leads to the legalization of abortion as a backstop. Whether that legalization comes from courts or legislatures, doesn't matter. This is a consistent pattern. So, contraception leads to rising rates of abortion. That was not something anyone would have predicted in the early 1960s. It also led to a sharp rise in the divorce rate. And this too was not foreseen. It was thought that contraception would help families. It would help give them control over their fertility. It would help husbands and wives to have more leisure time away from large families. But instead what we saw was family breakup on a scale that has never existed in recorded history. So these are just some of the outcomes of the revolution that starts with the embrace of the pill and the gradual destigmatization of every form of non-marital sex. And that's a destigmatization that we see continuing into our own time.
It's interesting that you've talked about the long tradition of Christianity being against contraception. I think that's something that a lot of Protestants don't realize. I know growing up in a Protestant household, we didn't talk about those things at all, but when I did hear about contraception and that there was a church against that, it was sort of like, that's the Catholic position. But I think it wasn't until 1930 with the Anglican Church was the first church to come out officially in favor of contraception. Up to that point, it was the unanimous consensus of the church against it. One of the things you mentioned, I think some of the results of the pill are pretty predictable, and we can all see like greater sexual promiscuity and all that goes with that, the breakdown of the family. I'm a little puzzled about the increase of abortion and how that leads to the legalization and greater acceptance of abortion. If the pill is, as you say, 99% effective, it would seem like it would reduce the need for abortion. So you said people didn't really predict that. Humanae Vitae predicts it. Can you maybe draw out that connection a little for me?
Yes, thanks, Keith. You know, it's very interesting, and I think part of it has to do with psychology, because once you introduce the idea of mass contraception as a liberating force for humanity, the subtext there is that babies are bad, right? The subtext is that life is unwanted.
Okay.
It's not conscious, but it's obviously part of accepting that package of autonomous control over ourselves. And so contraception leads to abortion for this reason, as a backstop. Contraception, chemical contraception, when used the way it's supposed to be, has a very high reliability rate. But people don't always use it as they're supposed to, and so abortion becomes the backstop for when it doesn't work. And what allows abortion to be as omnipresent as it is in our culture is the underlying idea that there's something wrong about life, or at least that life doesn't trump our conveniences. So this, I think, is deeply connected to the idea that contraception has this idea behind it that babies are bad, or at least they're bad unless they're on the schedule I have in mind.
So you've been exploring in a number of recent works the sexual revolution and its effects in different domains of especially American life. Your most recent book on identity politics, before that, that's called Primal Scream. Before that, a book, How the West Really Lost God, and also a book titled Adam and Eve After the Pill. I wonder if you could give our readers, our listeners, a thumbnail sketch of the effects of the sexual revolution in those different domains as you've explored them in those books, and maybe others that I've missed.
Well, thank you. No, you didn't miss anything. So, in my mind, this became a great puzzle because the more research I did, the plainer it was that the dominant narrative of our time, according to which the sexual revolution has been good for humanity, was being belied by empirical fact. And I don't mean by theology or anything religious, I mean the pileup of evidence about the damages of things like broken homes. And so I tried somewhat systematically to look at the record being left by the sexual revolution. In Adam and Eve After the Pill, I look at what it's doing to human relationships, what it's doing to men, what it's doing to children, what it's doing to women. And in How the West Really Lost God, I look at what the sexual revolution has done to the churches, because I think its effect on organized religion has been profound for reasons argued in that book. And now with this last, which I see as the last in a series book, Primal Screams, I'm looking at its effect on politics. And how did it come to pass that so many people in our time are so unrooted that they look for their identities in these collective political groups? Because I think the answer goes back again to the revolution and its weakening and at times destruction of the family, the place where people used to find identity and can't anymore in many cases. So the books are linked that way.
So I want to follow up with that on the question of political identity. And you talk about this a little bit in your lecture here, entitled Searching for the Self, the Non-Political Roots of Identity Politics. And I wanted to ask about this notion of fluctuation and changing in our political identity, because it seems to me, as a non-specialist, that our political identities for millennia have been always in flux, and allegiances change and shift, and people who were once neighbors can be convinced that the people next door to them are their enemies and deserving of being expelled or in some cases killed. And so it seems to me that our identities, this tendency to prioritize a particular kind of political identity as something that is greater than the common humanity that we share with our neighbors and those of other countries, is a persistent reality in human culture. But you argued in your book, as well as in your lecture last night, that what's happening now is different than those. It's different than that time, than when, for example, the Third Reich came into power and people were willing to lift up their national and racist and nationalist identity over and above their Christian identity or even their familiar identity in some cases. So you think that there's been a turning point in the question of identity politics as it's expressed in America that is, in some ways, correct me if I'm wrong, that is categorically different than these other kinds of identities that humans have shifted throughout time. So can you explain that a little more, and how what's happening now is different?
Sure, it's an important point because often we hear that there's always been identity politics. And it's true that there have always been bands of people coming together to further their particular political interests. There have been political groups based on ethnicity, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, etc. But identity politics, as it now exists, really is something new. And here's the difference. In identity politics, you have these groups of professed victims saying, you cannot understand me if you are outside my group. Only the people in my group have access to this victim truth about me. So whether we're talking about identity groups based on, gender identity or ethnic identity, white nationalism, wherever it exists on the spectrum, this is the claim that's unique to these groups. So going back to your example about Nazi Germany, what the Nazis weren't saying was, the communists can't understand us. You're right, they were providing this supra-familial identity, this, supra-religious identity, but the claim was not based on victimhood and based on the idea that we can't reason together, you can't understand my reasoning. And that, I think, is what's new, and it's what makes identity politics such a profoundly destructive force, because we live in a self-governing country, and if more and more people in this country think that other people outside their group can't talk to them and can't reason with them, then that's a problem for our politics. And I think we're seeing this on the national stage now, in the divisiveness and the increasingly angry rhetoric of these groups.
MaryEberstadt.com. That's Eberstadt, in case listeners would like to go there and see more about Mary's work. And just scrolling down and looking at at your titles, some of which I've read, some of which I haven't, I see a book titled "It's Dangerous to Believe: Religious Freedom and Its Enemies." It's dangerous to believe, you say. Why?
Obviously, we don't mean that in a literal sense. Believers are not persecuted in this country as Christians are persecuted in other countries. We're talking about something else, something that Pope Francis called the soft persecution, the polite persecution of Christians. And I know it's going to be no surprise to your listeners here. The public expression of Christianity has become more circumscribed, in part because people are censoring themselves as a response to the chilling effect in the culture out there. And we've seen different kinds of examples of this. First of all, we've seen people losing their jobs, as I chronicle in that book, for Christian expression. And this is much more common in England right now, but I have a number of examples from England where people, a driver lost his job for keeping a crucifix on the dashboard of his truck, for example, where street preachers have been thrown into jail for quoting words from the book of Leviticus. We see more and more examples of Christian institutions threatened with losing their accreditation because of their fealty to Christian principles, and we've seen this in Canada as well as in the United States. So that's what I mean by it's dangerous to believe. I don't mean that we face hard persecution. I do mean that it's becoming tougher and requiring more courage to be a Christian in the public square without apologizing for that. And that's what that book is about.
This isn't really a question, it's just kind of an observation about what you've said there about it's dangerous to believe and how things have changed in our country. It's reminiscent for me of the changing status of Christianity in the 4th century and the so-called Constantinian shift, where I think it was Stanley Hauerwas who put it in one day. What happened is, before Constantine, it took courage to be a Christian because you would be risking, potentially death, but also certainly estrangement from your family. And after Constantine, it took courage to be a pagan because it was what is culturally in vogue to do. You gain more status, and eventually it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so I wonder if, in the changing status of Christianity in the West, it seems to me that there probably is some signs of hope, even as things that we've taken for granted are taken away from us. It seems to me that might be an opportunity to recover the radical Christian notion that our citizenship is in heaven, the radical Christian notion that we are aliens and strangers in a foreign land. And so it seems to me that while there certainly are some troubling elements about what is changing in our culture over the last few decades, there also is a possibility in these changes to recover elements of the Christian past that we have allowed ourselves to be to accommodate in the modern world, and to have a very comfortable peace with the social order that we're in.
I think that's absolutely right. Some years ago, Professor Robbie George made the statement in a speech that the days of comfortable Christianity are over. And I think he's absolutely right about that. There's a purification going on. in which people are being forced to look to their first principles and their real allegiances, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I also see a lot of room for hope in what's arising out of this cultural chaos out there. There are new student groups, Protestant and Catholic alike, on campuses across the country, and these are groups that didn't exist 30 years ago on secular campuses, essentially trying to save incoming students from being swept up into this antinomian culture on campus. So that's a very positive sign. And we also see new scholarly attention, again, from across the religious board, to these questions of what is America about? What is the founding about? Did we do it right in the first place? Did we not? What is our responsibility in an age where pornography is ubiquitous out there and the products of popular entertainment are toxic? People are asking and trying to answer questions like this in a very healthy way, I think, and in a way that didn't happen in the days of comfortable Christianity. So this is, I think, all to the good. It means the purification of the church.
In light of all of these cultural challenges and maybe of the sexual revolution in particular that we were talking about earlier, I wonder if you might suggest a couple of practical things that churches or Christian families or just Christian individuals might implement that would counter some of the negative effects of the sexual revolution that we've talked about and some of the hostility that's increasing in our public culture.
Well, I have lots of thoughts about that, Keith, and I hope they're helpful. Without being systematic, I'll just put some out there.
Yeah.
Some of the best advice I've ever seen to Christian men came from a Catholic priest friend who's passed on. And he would counsel all of his guys, because I think men are under particular attack and they're more likely to be out there in the world. He would counsel, when you travel, take a picture of your family, put it right on the television of the hotel room you're staying in, and unplug the television because you know what can come in through it, and go to the front desk and tell them that you want them to block channels on pornography, even if you're not remotely likely to go there. Just as a public statement, every time you travel, be safe that way. Never, he would counsel, never have more than one alcoholic drink at the end of a business day. These little practical measures, I think, add up to a serious code that can help people keep their lives and their families together. The vice president took a knocking some time ago for saying that he had a principle of not having dinner with a woman not his wife,
right,
without someone else present. Well, my friend the priest advised exactly that same thing. Again, for men who are out there, men particularly who are out there in the world, these I think are very sensible guidelines. Now, getting away from that and toward the question of the churches, I am a huge believer in the grassroots effects of the church. I think when a family has a new baby in the house, the church should organize to drop off meals at that house, every night for a month or every other night for 2 months or whatever it takes to help those people get on their feet. I think organizing babysitting through the churches and also, extending that kind of organic help to people who are in the community by looking at, for example, counselors. If there are people in the church who can do counseling and there are marriages that are in trouble, let the church provide that service in an organic sort of way. I think we talk here because you guys are professors of theology at a pretty abstract level, but I think a lot of the way to make the world better is not going to come from these rarefied realms of ideas, but from the strengthening of the churches at the grassroots level.
So I'm still scrolling down your website. Stephen shouldn't have let me bring my laptop into our recording session. And I notice you have a book of fiction, The Loser Letters, which is being compared by reviewers to C.S. Lewis, especially perhaps to his Screwtape Letters. I wonder if you'd tell us about that book, how you got the idea for it, why you decided to try your hand at fiction as well as all the nonfiction that you've written.
Well, Jeff, that comes out of a very specific moment, which I'm sure you all recall, when the new atheism was riding high, and the bestseller lists 10 years ago were full of these titles by Dawkins and Hitchens and so on, that were bringing in, I think, a lot of disaffected young people, and having a certain triumph in the public square. And a lot of books were written against those, that were books that were theoretical in nature, and a lot of very good books were written. But I wanted to do something different because I felt as if countering that atheist narrative at the level of a story might be more effective. So The Loser Letters is the story of a young woman in rehab who is engaging with the subject of atheism versus theism, and in the course of the story, her own life comes out, and we see what she's doing in rehab and what choices in her life brought her there and why she is as attracted to atheism as she is, which is essentially that she wants to be off the hook for bad decisions that she's made. It has a redemptive ending, I'm happy to say, but it goes to the point that sometimes in the culture we can be more effective with a story than with argumentation, and I think this is especially true as more and more of the culture has secularized, and a lot of people don't even have the basic vocabulary that we use to discuss Christianity itself. So what I was hoping to do indirectly was bring people closer to Christian ideas by telling a story about what happens in the absence of them.
This is maybe a good time for a little bit of a break. So this is a question that I'm going to throw to the whole panel. I think it follows up with your comment about the importance of story. What one novel would you recommend to do this kind of work? If somebody came to you and asked, said they were struggling with their faith or they were looking to deepen their faith, and you had to recommend a work of fiction. It could be a recent book. It could be an older book. What novel would you recommend? And the rules of the game are you're not allowed to recommend your own book.
I recommend Mary's. That sounds really interesting.
So I'll go first to give everybody some time to think. I'll recommend The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. It's a classic tale as an allegory of the journey, bus ride from hell to heaven. I've taught it to freshman theology students when I taught at St. Louis University, many of whom were non-religious but were required to take theology at the Catholic institution. And I found the text to always resonate with the students and help them to kind of crack open their world and thinking about love, desire, and reality in different ways and enriching ways. So that would be my off-the-cuff recommendation. What about the rest of the panel?
Oh,
we'll start with Keith.
Jeff is telling me to go this way. Now that he mentioned Screwtape Letters, I can't get it out of my mind. I don't know that it necessarily helps people who are skeptics, but I think it's really helpful to Christians, whether they're devout or on the fence, just to see the world from a different perspective, and what could be going on behind the scenes. I think that especially in the genre of spiritual warfare, I hear that phrase a lot, and even in churches where I've attended, there are lots of books being written about spiritual warfare. Maybe maybe they're good, maybe they're not. I always recommend, before you read any of these other new popular level books on it, read Screwtape Letters. Take your class or whatever they're doing through Screwtape Letters, and it's amazing to me how many Christians don't know that book. So yeah,
it's another C.S. Lewis book.
Yeah, another C.S. Lewis book, definitely at the top of the list there for fiction.
Let me suggest not just one book, but an author, I can suggest one book. Walker Percy, 20th century Southern author, who I think does for us, for people born after the rise of mass media, cinema, television, I think he puts the question of what it is to be a human being, what it is to be a Christian, in very helpful perspective. The book of his I know best is his nonfiction book, Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. His best novel for this probably is The Moviegoer, but I saw a quote not from him recently to the effect that the movies are our cathedrals where we sit in the dark and we watch shining people in the light show us what it is to be human. And two people who are formed by that experience, as I think in one way or another we all are. The screens are shrinking now, and we're seeing it done on our smartphones, but which to me is more depressing. But Percy, I think, really puts the Christian message and the Christian perspective on what it is to be lost in the cosmos and what it would mean to be found in God's cosmos in a way that's powerful and accessible to people like us.
Okay, and Mary, what about you?
There's no arguing with Screwtape Letters as the number one source for Christians looking for fiction and trying to use fiction to understand supernatural warfare, among other things. But I have an oddball cerebral suggestion because it goes to some of the themes we've been talking about, and that is Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. And the reason is that it's fundamentally the story of an atomized young man who attaches himself to a family in which most members are religious. It's set in England, so it's eccentric. The characters are eccentric, and they're also fall in recognizable ways. And a lot of things don't go right for this family, but this young man can't stop being taken with it and wanting to be in its orbit because of the gravitational pull of a family that is also religious. And I think it's a beautiful depiction of how just the example of that kind of creation, that familial creation, draws people in. It's also very funny.
And really, I found parts of it very moving. The first chapter ends with one of the most striking lines I know of in fiction, where I'll forget the characters' names, but our protagonist is leading a group of soldiers in wartime through England. They're going to garrison at this old British estate, and he sends his lieutenant out. It's night. He sends his lieutenant out to scout out the territory and see where they need to go. And the lieutenant comes back and starts describing the lay of the land to him. He recognizes it as the estate of this family that you've mentioned. And so he completes the lieutenant's description of the terrain, and the lieutenant, callow young lieutenant, whose Waugh's picture of what mass culture forms in people, the young lieutenant says, "Oh, you've been here before, you know all about it." And the protagonist's line that ends the first chapter is, "I had been there before. I knew all about it." Sorry. Including the tragedies that this family has experienced. And that's how he kicks off the story. It's everybody ought to read it.
Well, that's a great recommendation. I want to, as we wrap up here, I want to ask you two questions, Mary. The first question is about dialogue. We live in a culture that is, it's trite at this point to say that we live in a polarized culture. It's everybody knows that. They know that the voices, especially in our political discourse, but also in religious discourse, are getting more and more extreme. There is a tendency to give attention to the voices that are the loudest and the most partisan. And one of the things I've really liked about your work, as I've been reading through your many articles and writings over the last few decades, is I think you would describe yourself correct as a self-described conservative. You would,
non-progressive
non-
may get closer to what I'm trying to get across.
But you have a clear vantage point, but you also you try to build a lot of bridges. And I'm thinking here of several of your articles where you talk about why is it that the pro-life movement has not aligned with the modern vegetarian and vegan movement, and that these actually share a pretty basic moral intuition in common. And I think in our culture, we very rarely see those forces combined. And I think it's one of the things I've really appreciated about your work is to find common ground. And I think it's perhaps the best illustration of that is in your new book, Primal Screams, available now. Is you took a very unusual tactic. Is at the end of this book, which this extended essay on identity politics and their roots in the sexual revolution, you invited 3 very different respondents to actually write responses to your book that are published in the book. A response from Rob Dreher, the conservative commenter, Mark Lilla, who's more of a liberal professor, and then Peter Thiel, who is the tech investor, entrepreneur, and libertarian. And I just want to ask you, what profit have you found in dialoguing with people that are so different than you, and how can maybe we foster those kinds of conversations more in our culture?
Well, thank you. I think it's really important, and that's why we included those 3 commentaries in Primal Screams. We very deliberately wanted to be a sign of contradiction to the times, by which I mean a contradiction to the siloing, to the divisiveness, and to give an example of what it looks like to disagree in a civil way. So, as you know, the commentators don't all agree with every aspect of the thesis, but that's not what was important. It was actually important that they disagree, but do so in a way that could be a model of engagement. And as for building bridges in general, the bottom line for me is that we are all moral creatures. We have an ineradicable moral sense, and it's going to come out in something about the way we live. To a lot of people who have grown up without a religious worldview, it comes out in places like the animal welfare movement, for example, or a concern about the environment. And I think we can work with that, because that's just a few degrees of separation away. And when people are concerned about the well-being of animals, I find it not hard to turn that conversation to what about the well-being of the human animal, the human social animal. You know, people are very concerned about elephants and what living in artificial ways has done to elephants, and elephants suffering because of being away from their families. I don't disdain that at all. I would honor that sense and say, well, now let's have a conversation about extending that concern to certain other animals like Homo sapiens. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of bridge building we can do out there without compromising on principle at all. And I think it will bring people in.
Mm-hmm. So that's great. I think the last question I have, which maybe Keith and Jeff would like to add another one, is you've been here for a few days in Austin, and you've been around the faculty for a few days, and I am curious what kind of advice or what kind of questions might you have would you pose to people who are tasked with the work that we do here, which is to teach truth about Scripture, about God, about the faith, in a very morally complex world. You've been around higher education for a long time. You talked with us over meals about your relationships with the Dominican House in Washington, D.C., and so I think you bring a very welcome perspective. And so any kind of reaction to the work that we do here or advice for us as we do this task would be welcomed.
From everything I've seen the first thing I'd say is keep doing what you're doing. I'm so impressed with the seriousness, the small c Catholic nature of what you do, the openness to ideas. And if it helps with morale, I would make an observation that I think might ring true with you as it does with me. As you do this work, it can be the most frustrating thing in the world to find that the closed-mindedness is actually on the other side. The caricature, the ad hominems, the reputation that unapologetic Protestant evangelicals or Catholics or other religious people get. To be on the receiving end of all of this hostility from the secular world is a difficult thing, and I think we all feel it. But even there, I see in that hostility a desire to have what communities like yours have. And we have to understand that a lot of people out there are disconnected from their families, they're disconnected from intellectual communities where they can trust other people to have their backs. And so I find it helpful to meditate on that from time to time and to realize that the ire that you're drawing and the caricatures of your position are coming from people who want what you have, which is an enduring community that also has links to a supernatural community. So keep it up. You guys are doing a great job.
That reminds me of something you said in your lecture last night about one of those signs of hope is not only being able to do the apologia, the defense of what we're doing, but to present a positive model that people are going to see and notice. Some will take that positive model and try to twist it and still oppose it to their last breath, but others may be intrigued by it, attracted to it, and it's just good to have encouragement for all of us in this task to present that model.
It is very encouraging, and we appreciate your having been here and entered into conversation with us. I've reached the bottom of your website, so I have no more questions, and there's an eBay auction I need to check in on. So.
Well, thank you. It's been a wonderful, invigorating visit on this end, and I will always remember it.
Oh, well, thank you so much. We're so glad to have you here, and Primal Screams is available now, as are the rest of Mary's books. So thank you all for listening.